Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Raluca and Simona. And Simona, I will ask you to shut down your screen. You didn't, but I will introduce you further on. Thank you. And thank you for being here for this interesting debate. We are living very, very turbulent time in general, but we never expected that organizing this debate about the European Cultural Capital Timișoara 2021, we will have another surprise since yesterday when we found out that the mayor of Timișoara had announced that he's going to undertake completely the organization of the Timișoara European Cultural Capital of Culture. And also we planned, in fact, for this debate that I'm going to co-moderate with Raluca Iacob, who is here. Hello, Raluca, and thank you for accepting to co-moderate this salon with me. We never thought that we will have to dive into such acute issues like this announcement that was made by the mayor, and we were really expecting to organize a debate and a salon that tries to analyze how European cultural capital like Timișoara can still move on after the situations that were obvious already in the press in Romania, telling us the story of a project that does encounter some obstacles and some tensions and some important issues in the logistics and implementation. And just to reassure you, it's not the first capital of culture that encounters this kind of obstacles. Now, the people that accepted, and I really am very, very honored to introduce him to you, who accepted to participate in the debate this afternoon, are first of all Bob Palmer, who is someone who's a sort of an icon of European cultural capitals. He is the expert of European capitals of culture, and also someone who both in policies and in practices has the direct experience of what does this mean at central and local level to imagine programs, but also what it means to implement them. And I am very happy to have Bob this afternoon with us. And I will then introduce to you later on two other participants to the salon. They are Jules Degut, who is a cultural entrepreneur and manager, and he's running art factories in Marseille, and he participated very strongly into the project of Marseille Cultural Capital, and also to Simona Fitz, who's from Timișoara. She participated in the creation of the file for the European Commission for Timișoara Cultural Capital, and now she's doing her own project, but she does have very strong and immediate interactions with what's happening to this project still. So I'll start by inviting, in fact, Raluca to update us a bit about the situation in Timișoara. Raluca, Iacob too was one of the people participating in a very intense and committed way to the creation of the project. And she also participated in the writing of the strategy for Timișoara Cultural Capital. And I have to say that I do have this souvenir, this memory in mind, Raluca, when I was Minister of Culture and we announced Timișoara as the winner. You were there in the back of the public library, of the National Public Library, and your face illuminated in this kind of amazing way. I have to say that I was inclining a little bit more, but this is a very personal matter, for Cluj. But then seeing your face and seeing your kind of light coming up, I said to myself, well, it will be great. Timișoara is a good choice, and then let's go with the flow. So what happened between 2016 and today? And now, very seriously, what's the situation now?
So hello everyone. Before I start doing this summary, just briefly about my own involvement in the European Capital of Culture, Timișoara. So I'm actually also, you can call it a citizen of the city. My family is there. I grew up in Timișoara. And in 2014, I worked for the cultural strategy. So I coordinated together with the urban planner Vera Marin the strategy, of course, for the municipality. And then I worked for with the association, Timișoara 2021, as strategic partner for cultural mediation, training, and research. Now I don't have any involvement in any project, and I don't foresee anything soon. I was invited here to draw an image of the stakes, the developments, and the problems faced by the city. The weight of the European Capital of Culture for Timișoara was not easy since 2016 when it was nominated as European Capital of Culture. I think I will actually start with the most recent news, which Corina already mentioned, but I would just briefly also like to point out the fact that today the mayor of the city, Mr. 𝐏𝐿𝐴 𝐏𝐵, has announced that the municipality will take on the implementation of the bid book of the project. And he says that this is actually a solution to the lengthy and powerful fights within the association. That actually he mentions the withdrawal of certain big cultural institutions from the association. Institutions such as the Philharmonics, the National Opera, and the National Theatre, which are, as we all know, very important players. And also he's mentioning the fact, which is true, that the municipality has been so far the biggest funder of the association anyway. Well, he mentions that he wants the county council and the ministry and the government to be partners. He wants them to do their part as per bid book. He invites the community of cultural actors and intellectuals to join his move. Now, this decision comes in a certain context, which I think is very important to be presented and understood. It comes after a series of conflicts, of months of conflicts between the board, the president of the board, and the executive director. Now, the board of Timișoara 2021 changed at the end of 2018, and the current president of the board has been, since the beginning, somehow presenting himself as the one who will bring on some changes in the way the association is working, mainly concerning transparency, governance, but also he is presenting himself publicly as the one who has managed to make some important pieces of legislation happen that will, at national level, who will secure some multi-annual funding, some better procedures for the functioning of the association. Also, this decision comes after recently a group of cultural operators has been protesting in front of the building where the meeting of the board was supposed to take place. This, I think, was happening at the beginning of June. So, you know, all this is just to mention only the most recent type of conflict and tension that has been happening around the association. This actually has a longer history. The most noteworthy would be the memorandum sent in 2018 at the beginning by a series of very important intellectuals and cultural actors, which were again putting down some of the things that were from the beginning, unfortunately, a constant accusation toward the association, things like, again, transparency, governance, management, choice of staff. This was sent actually to the European Commission, which replied and met with the people signing the memorandum. Some of the conclusions and recommendations of the monitoring reports done by the panel of independent experts, which happened in 2018 and 2019, I think, mention some of these things, of course, in a more diplomatic and elegant and balanced way. And I think that, I mean, I made a summary of the main issues identified as problematic. Some of them are in these reports, some of them are not in the reports, but who are very present in the public sphere. I think the most present is the one about governance, transparency, and management. These are the three top issues which appear almost always. Then communication and engaging the community are again very important. And by community, I think it's a term mainly used to describe the partners, the institutional actors, the organizations, the independent scene. So, you know, the group of organizations and people who would be your normal allies and partners to develop the program as per bid book. Then, of course, I mean, of course, not of course, but of course, in relation to what I already know is the lack of staff, especially for production, issues related to the content of the projects, which are quite far away as far as public opinion goes from what the bid book was actually putting forward. Some of the critics actually are more harsh, condemning a lack of vision and adequacy of the program in relation to the bid book. And something that also the panel noticed is the confusion about the ownership of the project done under the label of TM21. Now, apart from these things, which were, you know, pointed at the association, there are some things which are happening in Timișoara and which affect the cultural ecosystem, which are not actually directly about the association, but indirectly because of the way the association has been working. And I put down some very, very shortly some of these things. One of them is the funding. I mean, because the limited resources in the city are directed towards the association so much, I mean the public funding, much fewer resources remain for the grant procedures, the competition for other cultural projects, which, you know, raises a lot of frustration for many of the cultural players, because on one hand they are not engaged as they would wish by the association, and on the other hand, even the little stream of funding that would have gone towards them normally is not there anymore as much. Then there's also, you know, this rift that was already happening among the different types of cultural players, public independent, but also among the independent scene, which has actually, this is my perception, this is not necessarily something I read somewhere, has actually grown larger, because some of them have decided to work with the association, some didn't, and you know, there's a sort of deadlock among many of the groups in the city because of that. But I think that I just wanted to point out something so that we don't, because this has to, I would like to also move a bit on, but I do have a question, very simple one. Is there any community in Timișoara? Is there any kind of system in Timișoara that is supportive? I mean, I'm speaking from the point of view of the cultural sector. By now, after the project that started in 2017 to develop the association, etc., is there a group of people who are being positive about what is going on? I mean, there are people and organizations who are supportive, but I wouldn't call them a group. I mean, for sure, they are not as solidary in their commitment towards the association as are the critics. You know, I mean, from time to time, you see people and organizations liking and appreciating the work that has been done by the association. But we don't actually know how genuine that is. You know, I mean, sometimes people just appreciate things which are just better for them. And if those people gain resources and are promoted by the association, then, you know, that's an incentive to like the association, but we don't know how deep that is. Maybe it's just opportunistic.
Right. And what do you think is the reaction now that when all these issues of governance, management, and transparency have become this kind of have grown into this explosion? What do you think from your own way of taking the temperature of what was happening during this period? What do you think will be the reaction of cultural groups and of the cultural ecosystem in Timișoara?
You know, this was supposed to be my last point about the feeling of the ecosystem, because I think that for many of them, the struggle has been going on for too long for them to actually think that they can make a difference anymore, or that they should care anymore. So there has been a lot of frustration, not from the beginning, but I think that from 2017 onwards, there has been a lot of frustration growing, and even chronic frustration. And the fact that although there were protests, critics, memorandums, negotiations, even some consultations at some point, they did not see any real change in the way the things are going. I think that for many of them, it's just watching like Game of Thrones, watching a play, disconnecting, finding solutions somewhere else, just saying, okay, we tried that, it did not work. It's a waste of energy for me to continue to just invest in this anymore. I think, you know, but of course there are those that are still willing to fight. And we have seen in early June, that this has been happening. I don't want to keep too long for this, because I just want to hear and listen to Robert Hartman and the other ones. But I just want to mention just very briefly also, my last bit of the presentation is about the explanation given by the association for the situation that we presented. And I think that, you know, they always, from the beginning, it was this narrative that everything bad is happening because of lack of funding, lack of political will and support for the project, because of personal frustrations of their critics, because of personal motivated invocations, personal grudges, even. So it was unbelievable for many of us to see that, you know, not withholding the fact that funding and political will are important, but the fact that there was this shield somehow constructed with these arguments in mind to block any real request or, you know, any suggestion of making changes in the way things are working. And that's sad. And I mean that is something that speaking with the people that I know, it's, I think, one of the most saddest things, the fact that you cannot break through. You cannot break through with criticism, with nice talk, with anything, because there's this shield of defensiveness that is making everything not pull through, not convincing enough. And I will leave it at that.
Yeah, no, Raluca, just to make clear, when you're speaking about this shield was about what? I mean,
this shield was about blaming funding and political will for all the problems that exist.
Yeah.
And not taking in any recommendations concerning things that were in control of the association. Mm-hmm. Things like communication, governance, management, community engagement.
Right.
That's
okay.
it.
Yeah. Now, just to make an observation and a remark for those who are with us and listen to the conversation, there are some hiccups in the conversation. My collaborator just wrote to me, but we are going anyway to, I mean, the integrality of the conversation is going to be on our, on Insula 42 and on Facebook. For the time being, it's okay, but don't give up hope. So you can anyway see the whole conversation later on if you cannot keep with our hiccups right now. Bob. Bob Palmer. Now, I'm just turning to you because you probably heard this kind of discourse many times. You read about it. You sometimes were directly part of this kind of tensions. And I would like to, ask you to react to this and to tell us how do you see the situation of Timișoara 2021 according to what happened? And what do you think are the common things with other cultural capital? How did they get out of it? And what do you think is unique in what is happening in Timișoara, for Timișoara 2021 now?
Thank you very much for inviting me, Karina, and hello to everybody who's listening. In listening to Raluca and the story of Timișoara 21, for me, there's an extraordinary déjà vu. Very, very familiar story. I mean, I have been the director of 2 European capitals of culture. I've worked with 15, and I've written a study for the European Commission about 40 different cities. And the patterns repeat themselves over and over and over again. And I've come to an overall conclusion that there is something symptomatic of the construction of a European capital of culture, no matter where it is. I know Romania is a particular specific context, and I've worked there and I understand Romanian issues and so on. But the construction of a European capital of culture is in itself a big issue, because there are 7 major challenges to run a successful European capital of culture. And I think from what I've been reading and the story that I've been hearing from Raluca and others, is that Timișoara has not really faced up to these 7 major challenges in the right way. And I just want to mention what they are, and then perhaps turn to your second question of what to do now, which I know we'll focus on more in the second part of this debate. But first of all, there's the challenge of political interests. I don't think you can get away from that in a European capital of culture. Sometimes this is party political, but also the political interests of others who are involved, including the politics of the cultural sector itself. I mean, the big institutions, the small independent artists, those who are outside the entire system. So this challenge of political interests, unless that is managed correctly, will always run into chaos. Second, and kind of related challenge, all these are really related, is the challenge of managing competing agendas. There are so many different expectations, different priorities, agendas of city development, of tourism interests, of business interests, of developing the city's cultural life and infrastructure, the interests of individual artists, of international cultural cooperation, of social issues, people who are disadvantaged, minorities, etc. So many different expectations. And often, unless these expectations are sometimes aligned, there will always be conflicts. So that's another big challenge, which I think has not yet been met in Timișoara, of how to align the expectations, managing the expectations, even at this very late stage of the project. The third challenge, which Raluca did focus mainly on, was the challenge of governance, management, leadership, structures, boards, committees, the role of an executive director, an artistic director. In my experience, it's not so much the structures that matter, but it's the people who are making the structures work or not work. And often there is a set of skills that has been more or less ignored in the appointments that have been made to many capitals of culture. These are not technical skills, they're not artistic skills. They're skills about building trust, skills in relation to creating transparency, skills of how to inspire confidence. And no matter what structure you have, no matter who takes over the responsibility for governing a European capital of culture, unless these people skills, the human resource element of transparency, inspiration, trust are dealt with, no structure will be able to manage effectively. So that's another big challenge. There's sometimes the challenge of vision. imagining the future, trying to be bold, being brave, courageous, and challenging the status quo. So if you're challenging the status quo in a European capital of culture, which is one of its objectives, you're bound to run into conflict with those who have huge vested interests in maintaining the status quo. They don't want to change. So there is a conflict already built in to the fabric of a bold, visionary European capital of culture. The challenge of partnerships is the fifth challenge I want to mention. Collaboration, bringing together very unlikely partners, probably the most important way of achieving coherence with a European capital of culture. How do you get all these different actors, and often very different and highly competing egos, to kind of work together and be aligned in the direction? The sixth, which Raluca mentioned, is the challenge of finance. Always in European capitals of culture, getting commitments, managing money wisely, persuading the state or county authorities or the city or sponsors, etc. Every European capital of culture that certainly I have been involved with has had this challenge of finance. And then the final challenge, which is probably the most important of all, and I don't really hear much discussion about this with regard to Timișoara 2021, is the challenge of sustainability, of legacy, of ensuring that whatever happens maintains long-term benefits, that is, of developing the whole cultural ecosystem. So I think the huge focus on 2021 is really not the right focus. There needs to be a focus on 2022, 23, 24, in order to ensure whatever is left. And it won't be the memories of a big concert or an exhibition. I can guarantee that, having evaluated European capitals of culture for many, many years. What will be left is a permanent change in the cultural ecosystem of the city. Opportunities that didn't exist before. People given skills that they didn't have before. New types of partnerships that weren't arranged before. Different kinds of collaborations, connections with citizens who are sometimes totally outside of the traditional cultural structures, suddenly being mobilized and excited. All these things can be important. So very briefly, just to turn to the second part of your question, which I know will dominate the next part of our discussion, so I don't want to say too much about this. Can anything be done in this crisis-ridden situation in Timișoara? And have other European capitals of culture been able to turn things around? And my optimistic answer is yes, but without difficulty. It's going to be difficult. There are many challenges, because unless you try to improve things, that is, review what has gone wrong and make changes to meet these different challenges, it'll simply be the continuing crisis dressed up with different names or in a different structure. So there needs to be a kind of fundamental, honest, transparent analysis of what has gone wrong, and then perhaps the ability to make some of those things right, to correct some of them. And if that doesn't work, if there's no willingness to analyze what has happened, people just want to go forward and manage the things somehow, and that is not an option to change what currently exists, then I think the only alternative is a much more radical option, which I'd like to talk about a little bit later.
Okay, so but just to come back a bit, Raluca, you can put your screen on. I was not speaking about you. We can be three on the screen. But if you have any reaction to what Bob said, I do have two very quick questions, probably long answers, but quick questions. The first one, why is it so, Bob, that for so many years, there is this kind of observation about the problems, conflicts, tensions, which, as you said, create a sort of a déjà vu, right? And however, the way the capital is organized and the way the selection is made and the way the difference between the bid and the implementation is created, has not radically changed. How is it that this happens over and over and over? And the second question, from your expertise and your experience, Bob, who takes the decisions, in fact, who really is the decision maker in what is going on with a cultural capital?
They're two very interesting questions, but I will provide relatively short answers, really, and maybe we can come back to some of these later. I mean, huge frustration of this continuing repetition of the difficulties in European capitals of culture, which makes me think, as I said at the beginning, it's something to do with the overall construction of a European capital of culture. I've come to the conclusion, after working on this kind of thing for more than 30 years, that a European capital of culture is not a cultural project. It is a political project. And culture is kind of used as a tool.
Yeah.
And this is very rarely acknowledged because the applications, the bids, are made by cities themselves, that is the public authorities. And within that, there are always political issues at play. Many, many, many different interests. And I think the European Commission is kind of unwilling to really look carefully at the reasons for the dysfunction of most of the capitals of culture, because the European Union is itself a political project. The member states, the governments, and so on, you know, also are part of this overall political construction, the reasons for everything, and also the European Commission inability to really look and influence what is happening locally, because they don't have competence in this area. So the European Commission, although it may be very critical of what is happening in Timișoara, for example, or many other cities, and the monitoring committee, which meets every year, and in their reports, they're very critical, the European Union doesn't really have the ability to interfere. They recommend. And many cities listen to the recommendations, but basically what they say is, yes, 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 but do nothing. Because there's not the real political interest and ability to change. So hugely frustrating. I think it's about time that the European Commission, if anyone from the European Commission is listening to this debate, really has a fundamental look. Because this is not about Timișoara. It's about 60 cities or 70 cities who have had the same experiences. The second part of the question is who takes the decisions? I think ultimately it's who pays the piper, they say in English. You know, the people who take the final decision are the ones that have the resources. And so it tends to be, for example, in the case of Timișoara, a city council that has to take a final decision because it's providing the major resources. That doesn't necessarily mean those decisions are right. And those decisions may lead to other complications in the project. But that is what usually happens. Also, state authorities are sometimes, state governments are also very involved because they also have a huge financial stake. The only partner that does not have a big financial stake is the European Union. People think that, but the European Union's finance often represents 1%, 2%, 3%, probably less in some cases, of the total budget of a European capital of culture. So they don't have a stick really to beat the city with. So it's the city authorities in the end that have to make the decision of how to go forward in a formal way. I think there are alternatives, and there are alternative ways of utilizing the huge resource in a city, particularly cultural resource, that doesn't necessarily depend on the huge support of the city council. But we can talk about that later in the debate.
Yeah, but that's a very good point, Bob, and I'll just go to ask Raluca if she has a reaction to what you said. It's a very good point because indeed people have this kind of impression that this is their understanding, that in fact it's the European Union who gives the money. And they don't understand that, no, it's not. The European Union gives very tiny and very symbolic money to the European capital of culture. At the same time, they do give the symbolic aura of the European capital because this is how the contest goes. But in fact, the decision is in the hands of the local and central authority who decide to give resource to what they consider to be good or not good. And this is why all these hiccups not only on our discussion, but also in the way in which the capitals are organized. In the case of Timișoara, it's exactly the same problem. This is why the mayor all of a sudden can say, now I'm going to take over. Anyway, it's our money. So I want to do with this money things that I consider to be important. Raluca. And then we will ask Jules and Simona to pop in to the discussion.
I just have two very short comments. One is about the relation with the EU, which both you, Mr. Teo, and Mr. Palmer have mentioned. I think that the fact that the EU doesn't give so much money is less important than the fact that the EU gives the symbolic recognition. And it's not only about that it gave, you know, it put together the competition and it's the European Capital of Culture. It's the fact that in a country as Romania that has transitioned from, you know, whatever we had before 1990 to whatever we have now, the EU has played such an important role, almost paternalistic in many aspects. We have learned in a way to look up to the EU for approval and for recognition, and whoever gets recognition professionally, internationally at the level of the EU is instantly validated, or somehow this is the perception in Romania. I think that this explains a lot also why the image that the association and the executive director have at EU level is so important to them. And as long as the monitoring panel sees the things that they want to see, I mean, the association wants them to see, it doesn't matter so much the internal conflicts, the tensions within the city, because in the end, what validates them, their value, is what the European Union through this panel of experts says. I mean, I think this is a dynamic not only typical to Romania, but maybe also to other Eastern European countries that have relied so much on the EU.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's entitlement by the validation that comes from outside, from abroad, not internally. Raluca, just to mention here a small example, recently, for example, it's very strange. This happens in Timișoara, but very recently there was this article about the director of the association being validated by Culture Action Europe as a member of the board. And the presentation in the Romanian press was, why are there criticism about the director when she is validated by the Culture Action Europe board? Because very few people in Romania understand that Culture Action Europe is validating also the institutional value of someone who enters the board. You do not enter Culture Action Europe as individual, you enter it also with your professional capacity. So it's a little bit the snake that bites its tail, because in Romania, this is perceived as a sort of a legitimation of competence, while in Culture Action Europe, this is perceived as a sort of of course, we take you on board, you have this huge project that you have to run, and it's important for you to be member of a European body. Sorry, Raluca, but that's a very good example of what you were saying.
I don't have any more comments. I want to see the second part of the discussion carried on. Thank you very much for...
Okay. Bob, do you want to make any comment on this or not?
Yeah, just one very quick comment, and that is, in terms of decision-making, I was clear, but in terms of responsibility for the success of a European Capital of Culture, I think one needs to move into a different frame of mind, because in the end, it is the city that will either benefit or not. It is those cultural actors and citizens of the city who will receive the effects, the impacts of a European Capital of Culture. So I like a situation often where there is a crisis and people are not waiting for the key decision maker, whether it's the mayor or the executive director or a board to take the decision, but people are prepared to act collectively in the collective interests of the city. And I think the mobilization of that effort, and again, would maybe talk about this a little bit later on, can become very, very important part in ensuring a successful European capital of culture, even if the formal parts are not.
Yeah.
You know, that people begin to take responsibility into their own hands. And this has happened in many other European capitals of culture too. Timișoara is not the first, where people get fed up with the main foundation, with the city council, you know, with the artistic director, and simply say, okay, this is too important. We're going to move on and do things ourselves, maybe with less resources, but we're not going to wait for a kind of approval by a body in whom we have no trust. You know, we're going to actually do things ourselves. And perhaps a little later on, we can talk about how that can be organized and with successful models where that is actually taking place.
Thank you, Bob. I think this makes a perfect bridge to inviting both Jules and Simona to get into our conversation. So are you still there? Jules, Simona?
Yes.
Good, great. Hi. So please, because now Bob Palmer and Raluca were speaking about two different aspects, but Bob was saying there's a moment when people say we are fed up with this kind of nonsense in political decision, and we do want to further this project because we believe in it. So what happened, for example, in Marseille, Jules? I'll give you the floor first, and if you want to speak in French, I can translate. So just whatever you feel,
Well,
comfortable.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Hi everyone. I'm Jules 𝐏𝐴 𝐏𝐿. I'm a coordinator of a French network of independent cultural places, which is called Art Factories. And we are part of a European network called Trans-Europe Hall. And this network has his last meeting before the COVID-19 pandemic in Timișoara. So I speak a bit about the process, the ongoing process of European Capital of Culture there. And in fact, I was, as you know, involved in the one in Marseille, but also in another one in 2010 in Pécs, in Hungary.
In Pécs, in Hungary.
Yeah. And I must say, I also have this déjà vu feeling, definitely. And something is very sad for me in hearing again those kind of stories. So this is the first thing I share with Robert Palmer here. The second one is the feeling that you need to find some distance with what's going on, to understand the processes that driving it far deep through the actors. Because for myself, I'm more relating to a view of thinking that the structures determine the actors, in fact. And in those big monsters that are the European project, generally, and especially this kind of project, you have very strong determination of structure. So I will reverse a bit the framework to have a look on the structural level of European policy about culture. So we have to remember that if Europe is a political project, it's a project of a union, a trade union. It's more economical policies. It's more related to economical policies. So European Union doesn't build a cultural policies, even if a lot of left-sided people in Europe has wished that European Union do so. It never was about that. It was about an economical process. And in that process, there are, of course, a place for the cultural industry, which is an economical sector, a very strong one in Europe, in fact. Even if it's not only a private sector, it's also financed by the public sector, of course. But still, it's something else that building cultural policies, and something else when you build support for cultural industries. And especially, you can understand that there is a contradiction in the construction, in the project of European Capital of Culture, which is related to the fact that you want, in the same time, reinforce, empower the cultural development of people, which is in fact a democratic process, which is related to the cultural right of people. But it's a question of citizenship and how you respect that. And the other side, the economical process of empowering the industry, especially through marketing, territorial marketing, the building of events, of big events. It's a way to reinforce the value of the territories in which you put this event. And it's going to create on the market in between the cities all over Europe an appreciation of the cities. This is why the cities are very interesting politically in those processes, but it's very different and very contradictory with the process of increasing the cultural rights of the people, of the inhabitants. And then the problem is that you don't really have the possibility, or you have to be very smart as a political guy to deal with this contradiction. And you have to make choice. And I'm afraid to think that basically it's worse in the Eastern countries because the democratic processes are not so strong, especially in the field of culture. So you don't have a cultural democracy, or I mean, the cultural sector is not very democratized. And so it's very hard to fight against the kind of conflict of interest that are created by this economical struggle related to the process of European Capital of Culture. That's it, basically.
I mean, that's very, I was not expecting this kind of philosophical approach to things from someone who's coming from Trans-Europal, even though both Bob and I, we were very good friends of Philippe.
Philippe Grambert.
And I have to make this kind of small homage to Philippe. I'm very happy I have
Thank you very much.
In January, who was one of the founders, not only of Trans-Europal, where he was the very important ambassador, but also of IETM and other European networks. But now to come back to what you were saying, what you are saying, in fact, comes back to something that Raluca said and something that Bob said, because in fact what you want to say is it's also a big tension between what you take as a legitimate part of culture, like there is this tension between the big institutions and the big market providers for culture, and what really culture in its organic kind of development in a city has as a network. I mean, there is this tension, who's going to take more resource? To whom are we going to give more resource in terms of the European Capital of Culture? Are we going to really encourage the independent sector, or are we going to really be very strong with bigger institutions, with those who are cultural industries, etc., etc.? I think this is a very kind of, again, this comes back to the question I asked: who makes the decisions? And making these decisions is in favor of what direction in a cultural capital? And I think that here again, we probably are, all of us, making a point of maybe rethinking the way in which this project is done, because precisely not having a cultural competence The European Union should understand by now that some scenarios repeated themselves over and over again with the cultural capitals. So how do you make today a capital of culture that is no longer victim of the same ongoing obstacles and clashes and misunderstandings that happen? Now, Simona, what is your point in your reaction to all this discussion, and a little bit also about your feedback about Timișoara, because you are also part of the team, you are also part of the implementation team in a first phase, and what do you think about what's happening now? We still have 20 minutes, just for you to know.
Well, thank you for inviting me to this debate. It's an honor for me. First of all, I want to clarify that I'm not from the cultural sector. I'm not a cultural manager, but I have a background on open governance and participatory decision-making processes. And therefore, besides the fact that I've coordinated the process of writing the bid books, I've been the author for the governance design within the bid book, and the monitoring and evaluation strategy, and the one that I'm most proud of it is the audience development strategy, which is the core strategy for Timișoara. Yes, I want to mention that indeed researching the evolution of the European capitals of culture, at the beginning, they became more interested for the cities because they generated this economic impact, mainly in tourism, but not only. But more recently, due also to gentrification and all the critics around it, the focus was moving towards citizens and this democratization of culture and towards the cultural sector of the city. And in this respect, this is how our bid book was built, focusing on people and on the cultural sector, and mainly on the independent sector. But from this perspective, yes, I do share this déjà vu feeling because right after this election, I had the chance to meet a European network called LOCO, which comes from local operators' perspective. So they are searching the ECOC impact from the local cultural operators' perspective. And in that meeting, I've seen and understood that almost all the bid books tend to kind of be similar in this orientation towards collaboration, participation, and engagement values and principles. So all have this because all the winning bid books. And then in the implementation, all lack precisely this: collaboration, participation, and engagement. And yes, I know that there are almost hundreds of studies on the impact of European capitals of culture. If you have resources, of course, you generate different kinds of impacts, but I haven't seen a study in which to be analyzed if the in what degrees the winning bid books comes to life in cities. And because it is a reference, and the European Commission says now that the bid book is a contract for the city. But it seems that, like this déjà vu thing, it seems that the cities cannot succeed in really delivering their bid books. And yeah, this is a personal question that I have to Mr. Palmer, if he has experience in other cities, to what degree the cities can really deliver the bid books. And I also want to bring in the debate another key element, because I'm very glad that, yes, I totally subscribe to this idea that Raluca mentioned, that we are paternalistic towards the Brussels in every ways. I mean, in the city, it is a false assumption induced that the only authority to control and supervise the association and everything related to the ECOC is the European panel and nobody else, which is false because we are speaking about Romanian public monies. And indeed, like Robert Palmer said, European Commission doesn't have much power because they do not invest, they do not fund the project. They just give an award during the year. And this is what I wanted to add to the debate. This role, speaking about how we rethink this ECOC program, the European Monitoring Panel. It is a new thing of the last maybe 10 years. I personally thought of it like it should be a strong point for Timișoara and Romania, but now I'm not so sure, and I tell you why. This European Monitoring Panel has experts in ECOCs that have been engaged in ECOCs, that will be engaged in future ECOCs after they finish their mandate. So it is a very specific competition ECOC, and those experts know best, because at the local level, indeed, there still are perceptions that this is a European project funded by EU, for example, or that this is a project that we won, a title that we won because we deserve it, and then therefore we should do what we already do. And again, it's not true. So these independent experts that monitor and have the ability to guide the local leadership, in fact, they really pointed some key issues regarding what Raluca says, and I completely agree. The governance system, the management system, and all, simply a system that needs to be put in place. At the selection, and in the selection report in September 2006, these experts, the EU panel, monitoring panel, started with these recommendations: to have a system put in place, starting from the governance level, like functional supervisory board. So back in September 2006, start with the functioning board, and then going down to the management level in terms of delegations, procedures, how we build partnerships, on what terms, with what targets, what are performance indicators, what are the criteria. It's not enough just that someone is mentioned in the bid book. It has to be more there, because also the bid book is seen like a contract, and it is, but in fact it's a collection of concept papers that needs to be more developed. And therefore the European Monitoring Panel gives us this chance to design a system. And after a year, when we went to the first monitoring, because you said indeed I was involved in also the first year of implementation, when we went with our progress report, we didn't have a functional board, we didn't have a management system, but they weren't too rigorous on this, on their own recommendations, because probably they were giving more time to the association. But then the critics came, because after 1 year of expectations and a lot of people, I mean, everybody wanted to get involved and to be part, and they were willing to contribute, but there were no frames and no open doors for them to come and understand how they can get involved. And then coming back to the European Monitoring Panel, they did see, I mean, and these are their words, they did see after almost 2 years of implementation that Timișoara has a totally altered vision, that Timișoara has an unbalanced programming, that lacks overall coherence, that doesn't have strong strategic international partners, also because of an undefined program. So there were critical issues on the content. Again, the board was still missing, like the European panel says the board is missing from the chart. The advisory and consultative bodies are missing. So I wonder if they saw that we weren't able to put in place an organization by European standards, as we should have and we could have, because this was not an issue of funding, and back then the politicians didn't interfere, just didn't understand, but they all supported the project because were afraid not to support it. And yes, back to my question, if there were such huge problems on how to build a sustainable and solid functional organization, why did they advocate for more money to such an organization, for unconditional support, and for easy the legislative framework? Because now you understand why there is such a mess, because the money were coming towards an organization that didn't have the mechanism to use them.
But yeah, but you see, in fact, Simona, it's very interesting in a way, and I will let then Bob address what you question, and then I'll get back to you. What's interesting in what you're saying, among your own feedback and what we can feel your sadness about what is going on, are two things. On the one hand, you reinforced my question to Bob about why is it possible, Bob, that this process going always through the same kind of impasse, same kind of obstacles, it still goes on and on and on. And in fact, this created a sort of a sense even for monitoring panels that they encounter the same kind of problems. Like you say, they are experts and they know that other capitals of culture had the same problems. And because other capitals of cultures had the same problems, and still they happened, this becomes a sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. You are going to move on supporting this kind of project. Maybe I'm wrong, Bob, I don't know. But it becomes banal. At a certain point, it becomes banal. Hey, in Timișoara, there are management problems, transparency problems, and governance problems. And these kind of problems were already existing in other capitals of culture. A second point that I want to make interesting is that you see also, in a way, Simona, that the way that you ask the question means those experts come, they have power, and the power is their external power, and they should sort out the mess that we internally are in, which is, again, a very Romanian way, well, I'm exaggerating, I mean, a very kind of assisted way to see things. They have to sort this out. They should have taken the decision. They should have done this and that because we are not able to. Because things are wrong, and someone from outside has to sort this out. That's interesting. I don't know. That's my feeling in what you were saying. It's very strong, Bob.
Yeah. Not necessarily that, because they know that we in fact are on our own, on our own public money, on our own project, but they positioning like that, the only problem is funding. It's like putting pressure towards the Romanian public authorities to fund an organization that doesn't function by the European standards. It's just a matter of prioritization.
Okay, but then
the other first, because
answer. I know that this is what you said, but I'm just pointing out to something that's more subtle in this kind of way of addressing the issue. Bob.
Yeah, and just to kind of change the kind of frame of this discussion a little bit, because I know our time is relatively limited, and one isn't going to change the European Capital of Culture project. The European Union has committed to it to 2033 or 2035 or something. They will not change. The monitoring committee is flawed in the way in which it's constructed, the way in which it operates. The connection between the European Union through the governments and the cities also flawed. The whole competition needs to be reconstructed. That will not happen. This is the kind of debate of what to do after 2035. But I think the situation that Timișoara is in now, don't waste a good crisis. That would be my advice. I mean, you are in an absolute critical moment now where in the last 48 hours, there is a significant shift. And that shift could either be positive or negative, depending on how it's implemented. And I think there's a moment, in my experience, it may be 1 or 2 or 3 months, probably not more than that, where if this project is going to be, to a certain extent, reshaped, and if some of the key partners are going to be remobilized, now is a good moment to do it. You know, and what should that new phase be? And I think that would be an interesting reflection. There's not a blank sheet of paper. One has to accept there's a lot of mess on this table of Timișoara, and indeed in other European capitals of culture. Even in this year, if you actually examine what's happening in Galway and in Raluca, they are also in messes, not only because of COVID-19, that's what they will say, but because of equal issues of management and governance and finance and bad decisions that were taken and conflicts within the city that were never resolved. But now there's a moment in Timișoara, and I just wonder what can be done utilizing the cast of characters that are still positive about it. That is, and they may not be necessarily the most powerful in the city, but perhaps those going right back to what Simona was saying, those who were at the original conception. And I found this an also pattern in other European capitals of culture, that those people who were originally involved, who had the concept and good ideas, were all marginalized in the 2 or 3 years afterwards. Some of them tried to work within the organization and found that their ideas were no longer appreciated. Some of them just got completely fed up by the way in which the structures were trying to implement very badly what they had suggested. And even others very annoyed and angry that their concept was really thrown into the trash can. You know, and things were brought in that were important to others within the organization. But there could be a moment now of remobilization in Timișoara. And I'm not talking about hundreds of thousands of people in a street protest, but actually bringing a group of people together who still are believers sufficiently, who can perhaps use this moment of reflection, obviously with the mayor, because it can't be done without the mayor, to try to ensure that perhaps the direction is slightly changed, become more positive, that those who have been marginalized are brought back in to a certain extent, and that one really focuses on the longer term legacy. What's going to be left behind in Timișoara in 2022, 2023? Not what the events are going to be in 2021, because those are probably very difficult to change, but how some of the new structures and new ways of working can be implemented. I read the bid book for Timișoara. It deserved to win as a result of that bid book. And however, there is no relationship in my experience between what is said in the bid book and the actual delivery of the bid book. And this goes back to many, 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 many cities, not only in Timișoara. But I think you've got a good moment now, being positive. You've got a good moment. There's a little bit of breathing space. Nobody quite knows what's going to happen. You know, okay, you can dissolve something, but what's going to be created next? What's going to happen to all these existing contracts and projects and so on? So there is a really interesting moment for, I say, a constructive debate, because I think if the actors in the city are going to use their energy negatively, this will only kind of destroy any opportunity that may exist. So it's trying, and it won't be everyone, but trying to kind of remobilize a number of people who are still the believers, people who still believe that something can be done which is faithful to those original intentions and that vision, and who are key players in perhaps making that happen, probably without the resources that they had initially imagined. But there is a good moment for, I'll say, a constructive debate about not what should not happen, but what might happen, and to try to involve a few of the decision makers in that discussion. I think that there's a really good moment now in Timișoara to do that. Don't waste it. That would be my advice, because it is a mess. It is a crisis. In 6 months' time, it could be a bigger mess and a bigger crisis, and everything could be lost. So what seeds still remain? There may not be many, but what seeds remain that can be watered a little bit through new types of collaborations, maybe smaller projects rather than bigger projects, partnerships, people who are outside that feel that they really want to do something positive for their city, those who are highly committed to making this work, and to bring those people together in some way, you know. And I've seen this happen before in other cities, otherwise I wouldn't be suggesting it. There's a moment to act, and the moment is now, and the only people who can act are the people who are doing things in Timișoara, and perhaps some of the people who are listening to this Facebook broadcast.
I really resonate with your advice. In fact, we even tried with a year ago, or maybe more, with the team 2121, like let's focus 100 years further. So probably this would be the best moment to go back to this idea. But what would be your advice, considering that in 2 to 3 months we have local elections?
Simona, I appreciate that you take over the role of moderator, but before Bob thinks about this question and answers it, I would like to take the risk to have another philosophical answer from Jules and ask him what happened in Marseille in terms of, because Marseille was not easy either, right? So because it was not easy, how did it happen? How did smaller organizations take over in Marseille? And meanwhile, Bob, prepare yourself to give the big answers.
Well, you see, that's a hard question, I think. In fact, the first thing is that I wouldn't be too much in this opposition of the big one and the little one. I was more on a distinction between the dimension of culture as a fundamental right and the dimension of culture as an industrial process. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it's true that it's the both. And the both are true. When you play music, you are an economical actor on the market, for sure you are. Even if you don't put a price on it. But you are not only that, you are in the same time an inhabitant through which a tradition is flowing and which is giving it back like in a living processes, you know? That's it for me. So in Marseille, what is very interesting in Marseille, and it's part of the culture of the cities, very specific cities in France, Marseille is full of conflict. And all the Marseillais, they know how to live with that somehow. It's very hard. It's always very hard. And they are always fully involved in that at full time. They are the more political people in France, in fact, because they always fight in big struggles with each other. And it never ends.
So for them, the European cultural capital were just peanuts.
It was part of the shame. Let's say something like that.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And then they don't try to resolve the conflicts. They build on it. And some managed to deal things with that. And there was a good solution for everyone at the end. There was a big mess and something in it that were flashing away like beautiful stars, you know?
But Jules, did what Bob said?
An example, perhaps.
Did any sustainable thing? I mean,
yeah, that's interesting. An example then, just to illustrate something which stays today and was created at this moment, and what's very, it's very illustrative of bottom-up processes. It's the story of le GR13. It's a natural trail, but built by artist walkers. Mm-hmm. Do you understand the idea? It's a kind of path for the all around the cities and going through the suburbs, place where you don't go to have a walk usually, because you want to go to in the nature and see the birds usually, not the suburbs. The idea was to say, there are also interesting landscapes even in those suburbs, and you have to meet the people by walking through those places. So they built it. And they built it with the inhabitants. And it was a little communities of artists that initiate that, but they managed to match it with another big asking of the people, the inhabitants in Marseille, which is some effort on common transportation. So that way, they create a kind of new office of artist workers and some kind of new usage in the cities around those going through those ways, those paths of tradeway, even with some offers of hospitality from the inhabitants to the strangers, etc. And this is something that's still going on today.
Right. So they created, in fact, they did create a sort of an itinerary of the city in a way that for places in the city that were not explored before. I mean, in a way, they solved this kind of center and margin problem by creating an itinerary that makes people go to that place where usually that kind of place was not visited at all. So this is something that stayed. And this is the only cultural project that stayed from the capital and was sustainable?
No, there are several projects, like, for example, some improvement in the Friche Label de Mai. It was, yeah, there was big architectural work on it at this occasion that still are today present, of course, and that are some interesting contribution to the infrastructure of culture somehow. But well, there still also as the Marseillais still have an inheritage of the, let's say, the bad consequences of cultural capital of culture, European capital of culture. For example, it somehow it increased the conflict already existing between the big institution and the little independent places. That's true. It wasn't. It didn't heal. It was so they didn't completely face all the difficulties of that, I think. And this is something. It's not so easy to give an answer. I think. I'm afraid there are also limits to what you can learn from that.
Absolutely, but then Jules, before asking Bob to answer Simona's question, I would say that, like, you presented Marseille as a place where conflict becomes a quality. Yeah. It means that, in fact, the cultural capital pushed even more the city to reinforce this kind of clashy personality it has. In a way, for bad or good, this kind of project is like a révélateur. It's something revealing about the spirit, the very spirit of the city. Bob?
Well, what to do next, I think. I know there are elections coming, and I know that was the key question, but my experience tells me, leave the mess to the politicians. Whichever ones are elected, you know, I mean, they helped create it. They were partners in making it. And I think it is completely their responsibility to try to either resolve it or aggravate it. They will take whatever steps they believe are in the best interests, possibly their own best interests, but the best interests of the city. Leave that alone. Let them put out or try to put out this forest fire. Meanwhile, perhaps the cultural sector, those that are still able and willing and have positive energy, can begin to plant, metaphorically, some new trees. You know, to get back to these smaller projects, to kind of reinforce some of the basic issues of engagement and participation and dealing with minorities and making links to neighborhoods and involving schools. Relatively small projects, perhaps, but ones that will be fundamentally important in building or helping to build a slightly changed cultural ecology for Timișoara in the future and put the energy on that. So that would be my suggestion, because I think trying to interfere with the elections, the project itself has already been terribly politicized, etc., and will probably be used in the elections for and against the mayor, etc. I think the cultural sector in its purest form should remain outside of that debate. And again, use the energy and this timing, because very little may happen in the next couple of months as people are preparing for the election, using this space perhaps to get together, to collaborate, to build more partnerships, to decide what can be done, no longer to argue against what the city is doing, but to try to argue in favor of what they believe will be in the best interests of the cultural sector, and particularly the citizens of Timișoara, and to try to mobilize some of those citizens in these projects. And it's probably smaller projects. It's probably smaller projects because the larger ones depend on large finances from the city or other resource holders, sponsors, etc., etc. Smaller projects, plant these seedlings now. Utilize the time and whatever small resource there is, try to transform this anger into some form of positive action, and allow those who are angry and frustrated and so on to kind of deal really with the project in whatever way they see fit. And I think in the end, if you want to convene this discussion in, say, 5 years' time, remember these words, because I've just seen it over and over again in capitals of culture. It is not the big blockbuster type projects which have absorbed the majority of finances. It will never be the mayor that will be remembered. It will be the connections between citizens and artists, or citizens to citizens, that they will remember, things that have touched them, the memories of the year in which they have participated and they've actively been involved. So it's kind of going back to that pure statement. And what I think is wonderful about Timișoara's success in a way, or although it's quite a mess and a crisis, is it actually started with that pure intention. It's kind of going back. It's kind of rebirthed in a way, not to all the projects that are mentioned in the bid book, but the essence of it, the aspiration, the vision. And the people who could probably deliver it are the ones that were more connected to that vision and perhaps have now been ostracized or eliminated. Get them together, have a coffee or a beer together, and see if one can utilize positive energy rather than wasting a lot of negative energy in a way that probably won't be at all useful in changing the project as it is now. Rebuild, plant some new seeds, be positive. And Timișoara is an extraordinary city with a remarkable opportunity in front of it still. I've been there, I know that city. Don't let the city down, you guys. Don't let the city down. In spite of bad structures, bad governance, bad people, no money, don't let your city down. It's too important. It's too important. Absolutely. You're the ones who are going to be there afterwards. So keep positive, keep optimistic, and take some action. That would be my final words of advice, Corinna.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bob. Jules, would you give a last advice to people who are independent operators, cultural operators in Timișoara now for the capital? Of course, you cannot be more enhancing than Bob was, but let's have some real advice from Transeuropal and art factories.
Actually, we had a meeting with Transeuropal and the European Cultural Foundation on cultural policies advocacy for Europe. And I will say the same to you that we say to ourselves, we need to advocate for cultural rights of the people. There is already some work on the UNESCO level on that, the Fribourg Declaration of the Cultural Rights. You should read this text and use it as a chart, as the basic, exactly what Bob said before. I mean, basis of a cultural process, a strong cultural process that empower the people, the inhabitants are there. And I think this is what you must focus about. Don't overestimate the public public management and the private management and don't care about, in fact, but deal with building commons with the people.
Right. So that's again comes together with what Bob said, and it's maybe a new way to redesign participation. We are in an era of redesign the paradigm of participation, taking all this into account. Now, Raluca, because you are my co-moderator, I'll invite you to say the last word, and then I will end up with an announcement also regarding cultural capitals.
Oh, such a responsibility.
Just be short, Raluca, because we
very short. Yes, I will just, I just have this question in mind. This challenge for Timișoara. I fear somehow that the powerless in terms of reforming the way the association is managed and the way the public funds that it attracts are used are going to be delegated somehow the responsibility of the failure of the project if they do not want to collaborate with the association anymore. I feel there is a pattern here. Somehow the powerless are being delegated the responsibility for success, for failure, not for success. When success is due, is the association, is the former structures who are to be praised. But when there is failure, it's always the other one. And unfortunately, because the big book has been built on cooperation with the independent actors and the communities, if they were to withdraw from taking part in whatever the official scenario will be, there will be this perception that it's because they were not nice enough to work with the association. It's because of that the project has been not has been a success. That's just my fear. But I like to indulge in this complex psychological type of matches. I hope it's not the case. I hope it's not the case, of course.
Absolutely. And then, of course, this is a question mark. And what both Bob and Jules were saying is that precisely because there is this kind of anxiety, one has to understand that, in fact, citizens and individuals have their own kind of empowerment. In the beginning of, at the fall of communism in Romania, one of the first projects in 1991 I did as director of Untitled was called Seeding a Network. In 30 years since then, everyone who was part in Seeding a Network, but it took 30 years, right, are one of the biggest producers in Romania, Ada Solomon, second, Cosmin Manolescu, who did what he does. So it's all the 10 people, members of Seeding a Network, are today crucial operators, cultural operators in Romania, because they were empowered very incentively, but then they empowered themselves. They learned how to empower themselves and create a context out of this empowerment. But you know that what you're saying is good, because in fact, I believe that anxiety itself can be a sort of a growth potion. I mean, fearing that something will happen makes you react, and you have to react positively. Now, what I want, first of all, to thank all of you. Bob, thank you so much. Simona, very, very many thanks. And Jules, very many thanks. And Raluca for gathering all the material and being so professional as always, and having this kind of perfectionisme absolu in her ways of, she's a chess player, I thought that maybe, and this is also why she's thinking twice before making any move. Before ending this long, but I hope very engaging Salon Island 42, I also thank the French Institute and the Goethe Institute who are supporting the salons, and Théâtre de la Ville who are our partners, and want to make an announcement regarding the cultural capitals of culture coming from Interarts. So Interarts is developing now a platform for experts who are considered to have the important skills regarding European capitals of culture. So they are launching a call to develop this platform. It is on their site, on the Interarts site, and they want to support like that the possibility of existing capital of cultures to find the right experts with the right skills and create this kind of platform for capacity building. So look on the Interarts site and see in which way you could either put yourself as an expert or find a way in which engage others to describe their expertise for the cultural capitals. Thank you so much for all this, and see you next time when we are going to come together. It will be when the Timișoara Cultural Capital will be launched. I promise we will have another talk by then. Okay, thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Bye.